My name's Damien Gillis. I'm a journalist and a documentary filmmaker. My family hails from the Peace Valley region of Northeast BC, where much of this fracking activity that would supply the liquefied natural gas industry is located. I have many family members who work in the industry and have for many years, going back to when it was known as the conventional industry. And I made a film beginning in 2010, and it came out in 2015, called Fractured Land. And so I spent 5 years embedded really in that region, looking at these issues through the eyes of a young First Nations lawyer by the name of Caleb Bain, whose family also, many members work in the industry, but are also conflicted about the development and the impacts it's having on their land and waters and their traditions. And commitment to protecting the region that goes back for many thousands of years from their forefathers and foremothers. So I got a chance to see very up close the very real impacts on the landscape from the industry. What is really surprising and somewhat depressing for me is to see how little has changed, and even though we've had a change in the federal government and provincial government since then, very little has changed on the energy file, and it's just like the baton has been passed from one hand to another. And provincially, we see the NDP is just going full steam ahead with the LNG industry, completely oblivious to all the issues that we've been talking about for many years. And what's being missed is that this industry would be fueled almost entirely by fracking, and a large amount of new fracking. Even one of these plants, like the one in Kitimat that has presently recently reached a final investment decision, would essentially double the amount of fracking in all of British Columbia. That has tremendous climate impacts. It has local airshed impacts. It has enormous disturbance on the land that's affecting caribou and other wildlife, trap lines for First Nations farmland. And it also has an enormous impact on water, and we're talking about tens of billions of liters of water a year that would continue to be taken out of the northern boreal lakes, rivers, and streams, shot full of various chemicals, some of which we know, some of which we don't, and then used in the fracking process and later disposed underground or held in large tailing ponds that can leak and have other impacts. So there are a whole host of things that need to be considered. And when we talk about, the previous government, Christy Clark, referred to this as the cleanest fossil fuel on the planet. And I took those words to one of the preeminent climate experts on the impacts of fracking at Cornell University, Dr. Robert Howarth. And he basically said nothing could be further from the truth. This is the dirtiest commercially available fossil fuel in the world, because of the huge amounts of methane that escape during the fracking and subsequent processes, which is a very awful greenhouse gas, much worse than CO2 in the short term. And then the compounding of all the impacts from all the gas that have to be burned to create, to cool this gas into a liquid, and then to power the tanker's voyage to Asia. You have emissions coming out at all of these different stages. So from cradle to grave, if we look at the whole impact of fracking and fracking-derived LNG, it's worse than coal, it's worse than any fossil fuel. And so it's incredibly hypocritical for any government to tout this as a clean energy solution. And the NDP should know better. I've had direct conversations and made presentations to people who are now ministers in the government going back many years. They know this stuff. And I think they're really putting a lot of mislaid hopes and expectations in the economic benefits to the province. The reality is, in order to prop up the woeful economics of this industry, which has been demonstrated by the fact that there was 22 projects at the height that were proposed in BC, not a single one of them is being built yet in a 6 or 7 year time span. There are a couple that are on the edge of potentially being built. And the only reason they're able to do that is because we have slashed virtually all the public benefits in terms of royalties, export taxes, and other benefits that should flow into the BC economy and tax coffers to compensate for the very many impacts the industry would have. And that's not even happening. So if the industry does go ahead, it's going to be disastrous for the climate. With a few of these plants, we could be very easily reaching this comparable climate impact as Alberta with its tar sands. And somehow our governments, both provincially and federally, seem to think they can have their cake and eat it too. Their sort of gold standard is to be able to continue full steam ahead with oil and gas pipelines and tankers and these different projects, while at the same time paying lip service to climate plans. And the fact is, the scale of these projects and their impacts are so great that they can't be mitigated. There isn't that much low-hanging fruit for us to cut back in other places that we can even compensate for these new impacts, let alone be on the kind of trajectory that the world scientists tell us we need to, which is drastically reducing our carbon impact on the planet. So I'm just really disappointed with the narrative that continues to remain essentially stuck in the same rut, and we need some fresh thinking in this province and in this country, building a green economy and building healthy, sustainable, long-term jobs that don't depend on yesterday's, archaic fossil fuel technologies. We've seen, even in just after Site C Dam was approved, which has also been connected to supplying electricity for the LNG industry, and it's not green energy. It's destroying a huge amount of farmland and First Nations lands, breaking treaty promises, and it has massive ecological impacts. Even in the economic analysis that was done at the time of the Joint Review Panel under the NDP, just within a month or two after that analysis was completed, the prices continued to fall for solar and wind contracts, and we've seen them getting down to the point of being less than a third the cost now in places like Colorado. They've signed major contracts, and that even includes storage capacity for some of that power, which is one of the criticisms of solar. But when you have an integrated grid like British Columbia has, where we already have a number of dams where the damage has been largely done, it's baked into the system, we now have these huge reservoirs that we can use to anchor other forms of energy that can be layered on top of that. The fact of the matter is we're doing a very good job with conservation in BC. Our electrical demands have been flat for the last decade. They're not going anywhere, despite population increases and changes in other technologies, and people want to have big houses and TVs and all these things. Regardless, building codes are getting more stringent. We are learning to conserve. We're doing a great job at it. So if we ever did need more electricity on top of what we have right now, we could very easily bring in wind and solar and even potentially geothermal. There's been many studies that have shown the geological potential here in BC for a very thriving geothermal industry that just hasn't been explored. It's not receiving the subsidies that these large-scale dams and fracking and LNG and pipeline projects are receiving. If we were to put even a tiny fraction of the billions of dollars that our federal and provincial governments have put into propping up the dying fossil fuel sectors into developing renewable technologies, we would have no trouble replacing those demands with new, healthy, sustainable sources. The number one thing we need to be doing is conserving on energy. We need to be using less energy, and we're already doing that. Per capita in this province, our consumption has been trending downward fairly steadily for the last decade. So we're already on the right track. We have this hydroelectric system. We shouldn't be adding new dams to it because we now know today that there are significant impacts, even climate-wise. When you talk about clean hydropower, it's very much a myth. So building large-scale, old-school dams like Site C, that should be off the table. We don't need it. You know, the research that came out of the process of reviewing that project demonstrated that we do not need this power. We won't need it even by Hydro's own emissions, BC Hydro, till 2029. So we're building capacity with an old technology for power that we don't even need today. But if we were to get to the point, with the plummeting cost of solar and wind and the potential of things like geothermal, combined with an aggressive conservation program, we have the opportunity absolutely to meet our needs going forward with renewable technologies. And truly, no energy source other than conservation, which should be thought of in that sense, has no impact. Solar panels take energy and materials to build. Wind farms have their problems too, but we're talking an order of magnitude better than fracking and LNG and tar sands bitumen, and that's the direction that we should be going in.